A pretty good argument could be made that the overall focus of this channel is grooveboxes and their real-world use. I am someone who takes music production very seriously and tries to have consistent output and be the best producer that I can be, but I also want to make sure that at all times the creative process is as fun as possible. And I pretty much always use grooveboxes for my music production. It started off as a thing of necessity of I needed something super portable that I could just work on in the in-between times when I got really busy, and that has spiraled into an obsession/unique production process that I want to share with you. Hopefully you can take some bits of that and use them in your own process, or at the very least use that as a benchmark to kind of find what works best for you if it's in fact something different. And stay tuned till the end because I'm going to give a percentage breakdown of which specific devices I use the most. So, first of all, I pretty much always use devices self-contained by themselves. There is a massive asterisk to that we're going to get into in a little bit, but for the most part, I tend to use devices entirely by themselves. I have very minimalist tastes, and that goes from owning fewer possession and getting less attached to objects, and goes to not liking to have a bunch of stuff to deal with all at once. I don't like clutter or even anything that my brain perceives as clutter. And I do want to be clear here with the whole minimalism thing. A lot of people get really preachy about it. It's, I think, purely personal preference. Yes, consumerism bad, but also different people have different tolerances for having more or less stuff. Regardless, I like a self-contained groovebox simply by itself because it forces me to focus. There's no routing or managing cables or figuring out setup stuff to deal with. I can often take it somewhere else because I don't really like just sequestering myself in my bedroom alone making beats. I like to kind of be where there's at least a little bit of activity, or in front of a window or something like that. And I like the both benefits and challenges that come with engaging with a single device for its own sake. Maybe that comes in the form of fighting its limitations. Maybe it doesn't have that many tracks, and so you have to get really creative with how you build up a song. Or maybe it is super powerful and gives you pretty much everything you need, and that in itself can be a really fun experience of just taking one gadget, probably that's not all that big, and getting an absolute ton out of it. So lots of people are going to think differently about this, but for me personally, I much prefer to keep devices entirely self-contained and use them by themselves until it becomes time to finish a song, with the glaring exception that we'll get to in a bit. Also, I alluded to this briefly, but I like to deal with stuff as portably as possible. I've mentioned this before, but often when I come home from a long day of work and want to work on some tunes, I don't want to sit at a desk anymore. I've been probably sitting or standing at my desk at work all day. I want to sit on the couch and work on something as casually as possible. And often, really good stuff can come from that. When your inhibitions and self-editing tendencies are lower, you can often get creative ideas that maybe you wouldn't have come up with otherwise. Or maybe because you're going more off of gut feel and not thinking super analytically, you come up with something that's a little catchier or more of a vibe or whatever. I often like to produce music sitting on the couch with a device on my lap. I like to do it at a table, in front of a window. And I will usually bring a groovebox when I'm traveling. So I'll bring especially my MC101 or my Dirty Wave Mate. Those will often come with me when I'm traveling, and I'll just, once again, find little moments to work on tunes. And sometimes those turn into really cool things, and then sometimes it's just kind of idle tinkering or scratching the creative itch. Either way, I like producing portably, and that's the other reason why I like using stuff self-contained. Not just because I feel that's a more focused method that works for my brain personally, but I also like to be able to just have one thing to lug around, or even something like my MPC-1, which is not particularly portable. Still, I find there's a lot less friction associated with just picking it up, plugging it in, and just going. That works for me, so I'm often making music portably and very self-contained. The whole process from song idea to almost complete often takes place on a single device. And that does mean that a lot of my music ends up sounding a little bit segmented because you can tell an MC101 song like something that was produced pretty much all on the MC101, it's going to sound like it was produced all on the MC101. I've made my peace with that. I'm okay with that. I've even let that become a part of my sound in a way, of letting the sound of certain devices really seep into my own production choices. And that can almost become a feature rather than a bug. Although note that, of course, even though I do a lot of this music production stuff, I am a hobbyist, and so I will accept a bit more jank. However, I do have limits to how much jank I will accept, and so usually I like to export the individual tracks off of a groovebox and finish them in my DAW. This is very consistent. Like, when given the opportunity, or even when not given the opportunity, I will find a freaking way to export those tracks and polish them in my DAW. I like this because I'll have 80% of the process take place on the groovebox itself, and that's very hands-on, it's fun, it's tactile, it's creative, and it's not glued to a screen, which is super nice. But often I am missing certain like elements of control or fancy effects that I want to go in and use. Among other things, I always go in and cut extra low end and like surgically sculpt my EQ to get rid of like muddiness and harshness. And I have kind of a list of plugins that I keep coming back to pretty up sounds. I did a dedicated video on that, by the way, that I'll link at the end of this one. It's on my second channel. Regardless, I like that extra power and that extra polish that I can get from processing stuff in a DAW. And sometimes devices don't have dedicated song modes or just have like song modes that aren't very good. And so usually I'll make like a few 8-bar loops on the groovebox, and then I'll export those, kind of put them into a full song form in the DAW, and then do my final mix and master. That's how I personally like to do it, although I am fully aware that some people are going to choose to go more in the DAW, like maybe they'll just use their groovebox as a sketch pad and then do the actual production in the DAW. And then some people prefer to let their song be a little more rough around the edges and go no DAW at all. Maybe just use it for a final master and that's it. Purely down to personal preference. I'm just letting you know what my preference is, and hopefully that at least gives you stuff to consider as you're kind of like tailoring your own process to your own liking. Now, I do really like doing what one might call live performance or live jamming, where you're launching clips and tweaking parameters on the fly to build up a song like in real time. Certain devices are really conducive to both live performance and mixing in post. Things like the Akai Force or the MC707, even the MC101 are great for this because they can record their individual tracks one way or another. Something that can't do this, though, is the Novation circuits, and that's pretty unfortunate, but it's just an inherent limitation, and as a hardcore circuit user, I have learned to either work around those limitations or embrace them. Sometimes if I make a track on the Novation circuit rhythm, for instance, once again, I typically use that entirely self-contained, and so I will literally like mute and unmute tracks to record those individual tracks into my DAW and then work with them there. But something like the Novation circuit tracks kind of breaks all of this, and this is where we get to the massive asterisk on using stuff self-contained and on exporting tracks. Because the Novation circuit tracks, where it really shines is when you connect multiple hardware synthesizers to it. You can control those hardware synthesizers with it and pipe their audio back into the circuit to be processed by it. It basically takes the table full of gear approach and makes it extremely unified. And that's virtually the only time that I even engage with that table full of gear workflow. So for the circuit tracks, I'll often start off with it self-contained, making beats super portably, and then eventually I'll connect two hardware synths to it and then live perform a full song. I did an entire video on this, by the way, that I'll also link at the end of this one. That means that I am just recording the stereo output into my audio interface and won't get to process it in post other than some mastering. And so in that case, I'll spend a bit of extra effort to make stuff sound like extra clean, and having fewer tracks does help with that, but that's my massive exception. The circuit tracks is so good for my personal music production tastes, and like in terms of its interface, it just really works with the way my brain works. And so it manages to like break all of my normal habits with music production. So you might be wondering then, why do you have so many hardware synths back there if you like never use them for your main production process? You produce mostly with grooveboxes and you rarely connect your synths to your grooveboxes. What the hell are you doing with those? I ask myself that sometimes. Partially, I am doing live jamming with the circuit tracks, and I'd like to do more of that kind of stuff with the Akai Force as well, but I'll get there when I get there. The other thing I love having hardware synths for, and the reason I don't have a ton of them, is I love them as hands-on sound design tools that I can then sample, especially that I can multi-sample. Things like the MPC-1 have fantastic auto-sampling features in them that will let you basically just steal the life force of your synths and perfectly replicate, within certain limitations, perfectly replicate that certain patch that you've auto-sampled. So I do this a lot. I'll design a bunch of sounds over time, and then I'll auto-sample a bunch of them into my MPC-1. Then I can go back to just using the MPC-1 entirely self-contained, because I've just got all these sounds to play with that are from my hardware synths. And once again, that really goes with how I like to work on music. And here's a little tangent, but I think it's important. Having lots of sounds at my fingertips to work with is incredibly important to me. In my opinion, it is the biggest way to defeat gear acquisition syndrome, is to just have new sounds to work with. It gives you that hit of novelty, probably some inspiration, and can often make the lust for a new piece of gear quite a bit less if you just have those sounds to play with right off rip. And so for me personally, that's like the one impulse purchase that I pretty much never say no to when it comes to music stuff, is getting new samples. Preset packs a little bit, but mostly sample packs. I will buy multi-sampled synth packs. I will buy just one-shot sample packs. I'll buy stuff of like chops so I can use it to build like kind of like lo-fi and house. I rarely say no to buying new sounds, and encourage you to do the same. Partially because I think that's helpful for you. Genuinely, I do believe this. And partially because I've got $5 sample packs linked in the description that I sell that help keep this channel going. So if you'd like to check those out, I've got auto-sampled synths and one-shots for you to play around with if you're at all interested. Link in the description. So the actual process itself often looks something like this. Take a device, sit down, load up a bunch of sounds one way or another, and then just start tinkering. Start trying to come up with musical ideas based off that batch of sounds I've just loaded in. Develop that idea further if it seems like it's going somewhere. Maybe make like a B and C section, export those tracks, mix them in my DAW, and boom, you have either a song or like a little 2-minute kind of beat that could go on a beat tape, or have someone spit bars over it or something like that. There is one massive exception to that as well, however, and that is what I call the shower thoughts song. And funny enough, this is where some of the songs that I'm the most proud of come from. So often the creativity comes from tinkering, right? I'll start kind of noodling around until I come up with something that I like and then expand on it. But sometimes when I am, like, say, driving or taking a shower or doing something where my brain is just kind of left to free associate on its own, sometimes my brain will just start making connections, and I'll start writing a song in my head, often accompanied with lyrics. It's like the one time I write songs with lyrics is usually half by accident, and then often if I notice my brain is starting to do songwriting and it has some promise, I'll start to like lean into it and really start thinking hard about building up maybe a verse or a chorus or a melody of a song. This is where some of the stuff I'm the most proud of comes from, because it's kind of the most catchy and the most like accessible music that I'll often make, because it's just my brain going purely off of musical intuition. So if you're a longtime viewer, these song titles might mean something to you. Dystopia Rebranded, Forgotten Future, The Neon City, While It Lasts. These are all songs that I wrote pretty much all in my head before I ever laid down a single note. So usually once I've like finished thinking of this stuff, assuming I'm home, I will like rush to the nearest groovebox I can get my hands on and like doodle it out, or like write out lyrics in my notes app. Or if I'm away from all that, I will find a way to sneak away from people and like sing it into my phone. It is awkward as hell, and it's even more awkward to listen back to later, but I do not trust my brain to remember this stuff. I know that there's musical ideas I've thought of that were probably pretty good that I've just entirely forgotten. And it's not because they were bad, it's just because like you can't hold that in your brain forever. And so I will try to get that idea out of my head and into a recorded or written form as quickly as possible. And then maybe I pick up the groovebox and like make that fully formed song a reality. Or maybe I just jump straight to the DAW and do it there, especially if it's a metal track, but that's a whole other like topic. Regardless, that's the other big exception, and that is entirely unpredictable, and sometimes I'll ruminate on a song for like months until I finally decide that it's like ready to be made real. And as a reward for sticking around this long, let's take a look at a pie chart breakdown of the groove boxes that I use to make released music. Or if you skipped to this section, welcome back, you now legally have to like the video. Here's the full breakdown with a complete list of songs. A few songs are double counted if there was a true 50-50 split between the devices used, but for the most part, it's just one device per song. The MPC-1 was dominant, which I was expecting, although I was surprised at just how much. You'll notice that the MC101 and MC707 percentages are, in addition to being pretty nice, exactly equal. I was surprised that the circuit tracks was as low as it was, but it made more sense once I looked back at my YouTube output over the last year and realized that I spent a lot of time using the circuit tracks for aimless music making or demoing other gear in tandem with the circuit. I'll also note that I was on a huge machine micro kick at the end of 2021 and into the beginning of 2022, but haven't touched it since. I just prefer the MPC-1 for my own personal process. Also, just for fun, I put together a pie chart of arranging in post versus performing live, separated further by whether I mixed the songs in post. All of them were mastered in post. Unsurprisingly, given what I just spent probably too much time talking about, the arranged and mixed in post category absolutely dominates. What I did initially find surprising is the fact that performed live and mixed in post was so low. After all, I've talked many times about how I'd like to see this functionality become industry standard for groove boxes. This category being so low is a bit of an indicator that this functionality is still not super widely implemented, but to be fair, it's also probably because preparing a live performance and then mixing it takes a lot of extra effort, and it's often just easier to either copy and paste stems around or just do a quick and dirty live performance where what you hear is what you get. So that's how I, as a groovebox enthusiast, actually make music for my own creative output, at least for now. Hopefully this was at least somewhat interesting or helpful for you to like bounce ideas off of and see what might fit your process best. I definitely recommend trying out a bunch of different iterations of processes so you can kind of figure out, like based on feel, what you like best and what you find the most inspiring. It's going to be different for everyone, but it's worth taking the time to be really self-aware about what you like and what makes you feel creative. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see how I make full songs in the Innovation Circuit tracks, you can check this video out up over here. And if you'd like to see some of my favorite plugins for bringing groovebox tracks to life, you can check this video out over here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit.